November 14th, 1965, 10:30 hours, landing zone X-ray, Drang Valley, Central Highlands, South Vietnam. The elephant grass stood 5 feet tall, swaying like an emerald ocean in the rotor wash. Through the plexiglass canopy of his UH-1D Huey, Major Bruce Crandall watched the first wave of Lieutenant Colonel Harold Moore's 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment leap from the skids into hostile territory. The North Vietnamese couldn't see them yet, but they were there, hidden, waiting. 3 regiments, 6,000 men, less than 1 kilometer away. The Viet Cong commanders had laughed when intelligence first reported American plans to bring the war to them by helicopter. Flying machines, they called them, with contempt. Slow, vulnerable targets that announced their arrival from kilometers away. The political officers assured their troops that American helicopters were mechanical contraptions that would fail in the humid jungle air, that the imperialists were so afraid of walking through the Vietnamese countryside that they needed machines to carry them everywhere like pampered children. What the enemy didn't know, what they couldn't have predicted as they prepared their ambush positions in the shadows of the Chu Pong Massif, was that they were about to witness the birth of a revolution in warfare. Within 4 days, the concept of airmobile operations would transform from experimental theory into proven doctrine, written in blood across the valley floor. The age of the helicopter had arrived in Vietnam, and nothing about warfare would ever be the same. The path to this moment had begun years earlier, not in the jungles of Southeast Asia, but in the sterile offices of the Pentagon and the red clay training grounds of Fort Benning, Georgia. The seeds of the airmobile concept had been planted during the Korean War, where early helicopters like the H-13 Sioux and H-19 had proven their worth in medical evacuation and limited resupply missions. Army planners watched these primitive rotorcraft struggle against wind and weight, saw their potential glimpsed through the limitations of 1950s technology, and dared to imagine something greater. By the late 1950s, the introduction of turbine engines changed everything. The Lycoming T-53 turboshaft engine, compact yet powerful, opened possibilities that piston engines could never provide. Where older helicopters wheezed and struggled to lift wounded men from Korean ridgelines, turbine-powered craft promised to carry entire squads of infantry directly into battle. The question wasn't whether helicopters could be useful. The question was whether they could fundamentally change how armies fought. In 1962, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara ordered the Army to answer that question definitively. The result was the Tactical Mobility Requirements Board, known universally as the Howze Board, after its chairman, Lieutenant General Hamilton Howze. The board's mandate was ambitious to the point of audacity. Determine whether helicopters could provide the tactical mobility needed to fight brushfire wars in the nuclear age, wars like the one already smoldering in Vietnam. The Howze Board's recommendations were revolutionary. They proposed entire divisions organized around helicopters, units where the rotary wing aircraft wasn't just a support asset, but the core around which everything else revolved. Infantry would move by helicopter. Artillery would be positioned by helicopter. Supplies would flow by helicopter. Command and control would be conducted from helicopters. The traditional concept of a front line, of rear areas, and forward positions would dissolve. Mobility would replace geography as the defining characteristic of military power. The military establishment's reaction was predictable. Traditionalists within the Army staff dismissed the concept as fantasy, arguing that helicopters were too vulnerable, too maintenance-intensive, too dependent on weather and terrain to serve as the foundation for an entire division. The Air Force viewed the proposals with alarm, seeing an attempt by the Army to build its own Air Force. Even within aviation circles, skeptics pointed out that no one had ever attempted helicopter operations on the scale the House Board envisioned. There was no doctrine, no training pipeline, no institutional knowledge of how to make it work. McNamara overrode the opposition. In February 1963, the 11th Air Assault Division was activated at Fort Benning as a test unit. The division existed to answer one question: could air mobility work? For 2 years, under the command of Major General Harry Kinnard, the 11th tested every aspect of helicopter warfare. They developed tactics for air assaults. They experimented with different formations. They discovered that a single helicopter was vulnerable, but a formation of helicopters, properly supported, was devastatingly effective. They learned that speed and surprise could compensate for lack of armor. In October 1964, the 11th Air Assault Division participated in Exercise Air Assault 2, a massive war game conducted across the Carolinas. Their opponent was the 82nd Airborne Division, one of the Army's elite units, with a proud tradition dating back to World War II. The 11th Air Assault Division systematically destroyed them, using helicopters to achieve mobility that paratroopers moving on foot couldn't match. The Airmobile forces consistently arrived at critical points before their opponents, seized key terrain, and controlled the tempo of operations. The exercise wasn't close. The 11th Air Assault Division demonstrated such overwhelming superiority that the results shocked even the unit's strongest advocates. The success of Air Assault at Amau arrived at exactly the right moment. Vietnam was deteriorating rapidly. The Viet Cong controlled vast swaths of the South Vietnamese countryside. North Vietnamese regular army units were infiltrating south in increasing numbers. President Johnson and his advisers had concluded that without major American military intervention, South Vietnam would fall. The question was what kind of forces to send. On July 1, 1965, the 11th Air Assault Division was redesignated as the 1st Cavalry Division, Airmobile. The name carried historical weight, connecting the new formation to the cavalry divisions that had fought across the Philippines in World War II. But the Army's reasoning was practical. They were creating a unit designed to do what cavalry had always done: achieve decisive mobility, screen the main force, conduct reconnaissance, exploit breakthrough, and arrive at critical points before the enemy expected. Horses had been replaced by helicopters, but the mission remained unchanged. The division's organization reflected lessons learned at Fort Benning. 3 maneuver brigades, each with multiple infantry battalions, an air cavalry squadron for reconnaissance, 4 artillery battalions, including a revolutionary aerial rocket artillery battalion that would deliver fire support from helicopter-mounted rocket pods, and most critically, an entire aviation group with over 400 aircraft. The division possessed 16 CH-47 Chinook heavy-lift helicopters capable of moving artillery pieces and bulk cargo. It had dozens of OH-13 and OH-23 light observation helicopters for scouting. But the heart of the division's combat power rested in its fleet of Bell UH-1 Iroquois helicopters, universally known as Hueys. The UH-1 had entered service in 1959 as a medical evacuation helicopter. By 1965, it had evolved into the most versatile aircraft in the Army inventory. The UH-1D variant, which equipped the 1st Cavalry Division, stretched 57 feet long and stood 14 feet high. Powered by a single Lycoming T-53 turboshaft engine producing 1,100 horsepower, it could carry a crew of 4 and up to 14 combat-equipped soldiers, Maximum speed was 127 miles per hour with a range of 318 miles. More importantly, it could take off and land almost anywhere, required minimal ground support, and could absorb battle damage that would destroy more fragile aircraft. The distinctive sound of Huey rotor blades cutting through humid air would become the signature sound of the Vietnam War. Veterans would describe it decades later as unforgettable, a rhythmic whomp, whomp, whomp that meant reinforcements were arriving, wounded were being evacuated, supplies were incoming, or death was descending on the enemy. To American troops, the sound meant hope. To the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong, it would come to mean terror. In September 1965, the 1st Cavalry Division arrived at Quy Nhon on Vietnam's central coast. The division established its base camp at An Khê in the Central Highlands, a location chosen because it sat astride Highway 19, the critical east-west route through the mountains. The division's mission was straightforward: find and destroy North Vietnamese forces in the Dacon Con Corps tactical zone. The soldiers arriving in Vietnam represented a new generation of military thinking. They had trained specifically for Airmobile operations. They understood that helicopters freed infantry from dependence on roads, allowed operations in terrain that ground vehicles couldn't reach, and enabled rapid concentration of force at critical points. But theory and reality are different things. None of them had experienced actual combat. None of them knew how helicopter operations would work against an enemy that shot back. The first hints came in late September during Operation Silver Bayonet, a series of search and destroy missions in Pleiku Province. Small-scale helicopter assaults went smoothly against limited Viet Cong resistance. Soldiers learned the practical details that no training exercise could teach: how the rotor wash kicked up blinding dust and debris, how difficult it was to exit a helicopter under fire while carrying 60 pounds of equipment, how the sound of helicopter engines made voice communication almost impossible, how terrain that looked perfect from the air could be treacherous on the ground. By early November, intelligence reports indicated that North Vietnamese regular army forces were massing in the western Central Highlands near the Cambodian border. 3 regiments of the People's Army of Vietnam, the 33rd, 66th, and 320th, had infiltrated from sanctuaries in Cambodia and were preparing to attack the U.S. Special Forces camp at Plei My and the provincial capital of Pleiku. If successful, the offensive could cut South Vietnam in two, achieving a decisive strategic victory. The 1st Cavalry Division received orders to find and destroy these forces. This would be the division's first major combat operation, the first time Airmobile doctrine would be tested against a determined, well-trained enemy force. Colonel Tim Brown, commanding the 3rd Brigade, ordered Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore's 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, to conduct an airmobile assault into the Drang Valley to search for enemy forces. Moore selected Landing Zone X-Ray, a clearing roughly 100 yards wide at the eastern foot of the Chu Pong Massif. The landing zone could accommodate 8 to 10 helicopters at once, allowing Moore to build combat power on the ground rapidly. His plan was straightforward: insert his battalion by helicopter, establish a defensive perimeter, search the surrounding area for enemy forces, and engage them when found. The operation was scheduled to begin at 10:30 hours on November 14th. What Moore didn't know, what no American intelligence had detected, was that elements of 2 North Vietnamese regiments were positioned less than a kilometer away from Landing Zone X-Ray. The 66th Regiment had been resting in base camps on the Chu Pong Massif when scouts reported incoming American helicopters. The 33rd Regiment, which had been preparing to attack Plei My, received orders to converge on the landing zone. The Americans were inserting themselves directly into a hornet's nest. Major Bruce Crandall commanded the helicopter company tasked with flying Moore's battalion into landing zone X-ray. Crandall was a career aviator who had trained for exactly this mission, but as his flight of 16 UH-1D Hueys approached the landing zone that November morning, everything looked wrong. What aerial reconnaissance had identified as an open clearing was actually thick elephant grass 5 feet tall, dotted with termite mounds 8 feet high. The tree line around the clearing edge stood dense and dark, perfect cover for enemy forces. As the first helicopters touched down and troops jumped into the grass, Crandall knew with certainty that if the North Vietnamese were anywhere in the area, a fight was coming. The first soldiers to hit the ground were men of B Company, 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry. They emerged from the helicopters with weapons ready, fanning out to establish a perimeter. The landing zone was quiet. Too quiet. Moore directed the continuing lifts, building combat power as more helicopters arrived. Each Huey could carry 8 to 10 soldiers, depending on equipment and conditions. With only 16 helicopters available and a battalion of over 400 men to move, the insertion would take multiple trips, approximately 90 minutes total. For those critical 90 minutes, Moore would have only a portion of his force on the ground. By noon, Moore had 2 companies on the ground. He ordered B Company to sweep west toward the mountain, while A Company held the landing zone. Lieutenant Henry Herrick's 2nd Platoon of B Company moved cautiously through the thick vegetation toward the tree line. At 12:15, they spotted North Vietnamese soldiers. Herrick reported enemy contact. Then all hell broke loose. The North Vietnamese 66th Regiment had received orders to attack immediately, to destroy the Americans before they could establish defensive positions. Hundreds of North Vietnamese soldiers, veterans of campaigns against the French and years of jungle warfare, emerged from concealed positions and charged Herrick's isolated platoon. The Americans fought desperately, their M16 rifles and M60 machine guns cutting down wave after wave of attackers. But the enemy kept coming, flowing around the platoon's flanks, threatening to overrun their position. Herrick's platoon was cut off. Moore could hear the volume of fire from their position, could hear Herrick's increasingly desperate radio calls for assistance, but couldn't reach them without exposing his limited forces to the same fate. The entire North Vietnamese plan became clear in that moment. They weren't trying to ambush the landing zone. They were trying to annihilate the entire American battalion by overwhelming it before reinforcements could arrive. The Battle of Landing Zone X-ray would rage for 3 days. It would become the subject of books and films, analyzed by military historians as a watershed moment in the Vietnam War. But in the first hours of combat, what mattered was whether Airmobile doctrine could survive contact with a numerically superior enemy force. The answer would be written by helicopter crews flying into hell. Crandall's helicopters returned throughout the afternoon and into the night, bringing ammunition, water, and reinforcements while evacuating wounded. North Vietnamese machine gun and rifle fire raked the landing zone on every approach. Several helicopters took hits. Door gunners returned fire with M60 machine guns mounted in the open doors, pouring thousands of rounds into the tree line. The violence was incomprehensible. Soldiers who survived would describe it as unlike any training exercise, unlike any previous combat experience, a sustained fury of fire and explosions that seemed to have no end. The North Vietnamese discovered something their commanders hadn't anticipated. American helicopters could be hit, could take battle damage, but they didn't stop coming. a Huey with bullet holes in the fuselage, with hydraulic fluid streaming from severed lines, with pieces of the engine cowling shot away, would limp back to base, be patched by mechanics, and return to the fight. The simplicity of helicopter mechanical systems, the redundancy built into critical components, and the determination of crews who refused to abandon soldiers on the ground combined to create a level of operational sustainability the enemy hadn't encountered. On the ground, Moore's battalion fought with the kind of intensity that medals and nightmares are made of. Artillery support from nearby fire bases pounded North Vietnamese positions with 111mm howitzers. Air Force F-100 and F-4 fighters made repeated bombing and strafing runs, dropping high explosive bombs and napalm within meters of American positions. A-1 Sky Raider attack aircraft circled overhead for hours, their pilots making gun runs whenever North Vietnamese forces tried to mass for another assault. But the most critical support came from helicopter gunships. UH-1B and UH-1C Hueys equipped with M60 machine guns, 2.75-inch rocket pods, and in some cases 40mm grenade launchers, orbited the landing zone like deadly guardian angels. When North Vietnamese forces tried to overrun American positions, gunship pilots would dive through enemy fire, rockets rippling off in pairs, door gunners and nose-mounted weapons creating a wall of fire that broke up attack after attack. The gunships took terrible punishment. Multiple aircraft returned to base with critical damage. Crew chiefs counted hundreds of bullet holes, but they kept flying. The Aerial Rocket Artillery Battalion, equipped with UH-1B helicopters mounting 48 2.75-inch rockets each, provided artillery fire from the sky. These rockets, each with a warhead equivalent to a 105mm artillery shell, could be delivered with devastating accuracy by pilots who could see their targets. Traditional artillery had to rely on forward observers calling in fire missions. The aerial rocket artillery eliminated the middleman, placing explosive power precisely where the ground commander needed it within minutes of a request. As darkness fell on November 14th, Moore's battalion had suffered significant casualties but held the landing zone. Lieutenant Herrick's cut-off platoon had fought throughout the day, eventually being overwhelmed. Herrick was killed. Most of his men died with him. A rescue party fighting through intense fire finally reached the position and extracted the survivors. The cost had been terrible, but Moore's battalion still held landing zone X-ray. Throughout the night, helicopters continued flying. In darkness, with enemy fire erupting from the tree line, Hueys equipped with landing lights came in to evacuate critical casualties and deliver ammunition. The pilots flew by instrument, trusting their skills and their aircraft, because soldiers were dying on the ground and needed help that only helicopters could provide. The courage required was extraordinary. Landing a helicopter in a hot landing zone in daylight is dangerous. Doing it at night, when you can't see the enemy firing at you, when your landing lights make you a perfect target, requires either supreme confidence or absolute commitment to the mission. The pilots of the 1st Cavalry Division demonstrated both. By November 15th, Moore had been reinforced by additional companies flown in overnight. The North Vietnamese prepared for another assault, throwing the 33rd Regiment into the battle. The fighting intensified. At one point, North Vietnamese soldiers reached the battalion command post, close enough that Moore and his staff were shooting at enemy soldiers meters away. American artillery fired so close to friendly positions that shrapnel wounded American troops. Airstrikes came in danger close, within 50 meters of the defensive perimeter. The entire American position was ringed with fire and steel. The North Vietnamese were learning brutal lessons about American firepower. Their tactical doctrine emphasized hugging American forces, staying so close that artillery and air support couldn't be used without hitting friendly troops. The tactic had worked against the French and South Vietnamese. But American commanders, fighting for survival with their backs against the wall, called in fire support anyway, accepting the risk of friendly casualties to stop enemy assaults. The North Vietnamese also discovered that American infantry weapons, particularly the M60 machine gun and M79 grenade launcher, could generate sustained firepower that broke up attack formations. Most critically, the North Vietnamese realized that American helicopter mobility made traditional battlefield calculations meaningless. They had planned to fight a battalion. Within 24 hours, they were fighting a brigade-strength force because helicopters had flown in reinforcements faster than the enemy could adjust. Fresh troops, fresh ammunition, fresh artillery batteries positioned by Chinook helicopters. The Americans could concentrate combat power at a critical point with a speed that defied conventional military wisdom. By November 16th, the Waukegan Battalion, 7th Cavalry, and the 2nd Battalion, 5th Cavalry, had been inserted at Landing Zone X-Ray to reinforce more. The North Vietnamese, having suffered catastrophic casualties estimated at over 1,000 killed, began withdrawing toward their Cambodian sanctuaries. American forces had held the landing zone, inflicted tremendous losses on the enemy, and validated the Airmobile concept under the worst possible conditions. But the Battle of Ia Drang wasn't over. On November 17th, Lieutenant Colonel Robert McDade's 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, was conducting a tactical march to Landing Zone Albany, a few kilometers north of X-Ray, when they were ambushed by North Vietnamese forces. The battalion was caught in thick vegetation, units became separated, and the North Vietnamese attacked with the kind of ferocity that overwhelmed American firepower. The Battle of Landing Zone Albany would be the deadliest single day for American forces during the entire Vietnam War. Approximately 155 Americans were killed in a few hours of savage close-quarters combat. The contrast between X-Ray and Albany revealed both the power and limitations of airmobile warfare. At X-Ray, helicopters had provided mobility, fire support, supply, and medical evacuation that enabled an isolated battalion to survive against superior numbers. At Albany, forces moving on foot through dense terrain were vulnerable to ambush in ways that couldn't be mitigated by helicopter support. The lessons were clear. Helicopter mobility was a tremendous advantage, but only when properly employed. Infantry still needed to maintain tactical discipline, maintain communications, and fight effectively, regardless of how they arrived at the battlefield. The statistics from the Drang Valley battles told conflicting stories. American forces suffered 305 killed and 524 wounded. North Vietnamese casualties were estimated at over 3,500 killed, though actual numbers remained disputed. American commanders looked at the casualty ratio, 12 North Vietnamese killed for every American, and concluded that a war of attrition was winnable. Send more troops, inflict more casualties, and eventually the enemy would quit. It was a fatally flawed conclusion based on incomplete understanding of enemy strategy, but it would drive American policy for years. The North Vietnamese drew different conclusions. They had learned that they couldn't defeat American forces in conventional battles where American firepower could be brought to bear. The solution was to avoid large unit engagements, rely on guerrilla tactics, control the tempo of combat by engaging only when favorable odds existed, and withdraw before American reinforcements could arrive. Most importantly, North Vietnamese commanders learned that they could absorb casualties that would break most armies and continue fighting because their political system and ideology created a willingness to sacrifice that American democracy couldn't match. But both sides agreed on one thing: the helicopter had fundamentally changed warfare in Vietnam. What had seemed impossible before Ia Drang became routine afterward. Battalions could be moved 50 kilometers in an hour. Artillery could be positioned on mountaintops that no road could reach. Wounded soldiers could be in surgery within an hour of being hit, a speed of medical evacuation that saved thousands of lives and would have been impossible in any previous war. Supply lines that traditionally stretched hundreds of kilometers along vulnerable roads were replaced by helicopter logistics that could deliver tons of supplies directly to forward positions. The success at Ia Drang validated the entire Airmobile concept. The Army rapidly expanded helicopter forces in Vietnam. By 1968, the 1st Aviation Brigade coordinated over 4,000 Army aircraft in country. 14 aviation battalions and 3 air cavalry squadrons supported ground operations across all 4 core tactical zones. Every major American and South Vietnamese unit had helicopter support for movement, supply, and medical evacuation. The Huey became the symbol of the American war effort, appearing in thousands of photographs and hours of film footage. Images of door gunners firing from open doors, of wounded being loaded onto stretchers, of troops jumping from landing skids into elephant grass, defined how Americans at home visualized the war. The distinctive sound of Huey rotor blades became instantly recognizable to anyone who served in Vietnam, a sound that triggered powerful emotional responses decades after the war ended. The versatility of the Huey was extraordinary. The same basic airframe served as troop transport, slicks in soldier slang, gunship, command and control platform, medical evacuation aircraft, and search and rescue vehicle. Modifications could transform a Huey for specialized missions within hours, mount M60 machine guns and rocket pods, and it became a gunship. Install medical litters, and it became a medevac. Add radios and map boards, and it became a flying command post. This adaptability made the Huey indispensable. Huey crews developed legendary reputations. Pilots flew multiple missions daily, often 12 to 16 hours of flight time. They landed in hot LZs under fire, navigated through monsoon storms that grounded other aircraft, and flew at night with minimal instruments through mountains and jungle. Door gunners manned M60 machine guns through hours of flight, ready to suppress enemy fire the moment it erupted. Crew chiefs maintained aircraft under field conditions, performing repairs with limited tools and parts, keeping helicopters flying through maintenance requirements that would have grounded them under peacetime standards. The casualty rate among helicopter crews was staggering. Over 5,000 helicopter crewmen were killed during the war. Approximately 2,200 were pilots, 2,700 were door gunners and crew chiefs, and the remainder were passengers being transported. An estimated 12,000 helicopters were hit by enemy fire, with roughly 5,000 destroyed. The intensity of operations meant that some helicopters flew 1,000 hours in a year, experiencing combat on almost every mission. Survival often came down to a combination of pilot skill, aircraft durability, and pure luck. The enemy learned to target helicopters aggressively. Anti-aircraft weapons ranging from small arms fire to heavy machine guns to shoulder-fired rockets were positioned along known helicopter routes. Landing zones were pre-registered for mortar and artillery fire. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces became adept at waiting for helicopters to land or take off when they were most vulnerable before opening fire. The cat-and-mouse game between helicopter crews and anti-aircraft gunners became a deadly aspect of the air war. American tactics evolved to counter these threats. Helicopter formations became more sophisticated. A typical combat assault would include multiple Huey slicks carrying infantry, UH-1 gunships for fire support, command and control helicopters orbiting overhead, and often light observation helicopters scouting ahead. Artillery preparation would pound the landing zone before helicopters arrived. Air Force or Navy tactical aircraft would make strikes minutes before the assault. The coordination required was immense, but became routine through practice and standardized procedures. The CH-47 Chinook heavy lift helicopter provided capabilities that smaller aircraft couldn't match. With twin rotors and two powerful turboshaft engines, the Chinook could carry 33 to 55 troops, or up to 10,000 kilograms of cargo. More importantly, it could lift artillery pieces, move armored vehicles, and recover downed helicopters. The recovery mission became critical. Every downed helicopter in enemy territory contained sensitive equipment, classified radios, and potentially surviving crew members. Chinooks would fly into hostile areas, hovering while crew hooked damaged helicopters to external cargo hooks, then carry them away, despite taking fire. The most spectacular Chinook missions involved moving artillery. A 105mm howitzer with ammunition and crew could be airlifted to a firebase on a mountain peak inaccessible by any other means. Within hours, that firebase would be firing in support of infantry operations kilometers away. When the tactical situation changed, the entire firebase could be picked up and moved to a new location. This flexibility meant that American forces always had artillery support, even in terrain that should have made it impossible. At the war's peak in 1968, the Army operated 21 Chinook companies in Vietnam, with nearly 750 Chinooks. Approximately 200 were lost to combat or operational accidents. Despite these losses, the Chinook proved exceptionally reliable. Its twin-engine design provided redundancy. If one engine failed, the helicopter could still fly. The tandem rotor configuration was stable and forgiving. Maintenance, while demanding, was manageable under field conditions. Crews learned to love the Chinook for its ability to absorb punishment and keep flying. The development of helicopter gunships added a new dimension to air support. Early gunships were improvised. UH-1 Hueys with door-mounted machine guns and rocket pods. But these makeshift weapons platforms demonstrated the concept's value. A dedicated gunship, armed and armored for combat, could provide immediate fire support that didn't require coordination with distant artillery or waiting for tactical aircraft. The Bell AH-1 Cobra, introduced in 1967, represented the culmination of gunship development. Designed from the beginning as an attack helicopter, the Cobra used the same engine and rotor system as the Huey, but mounted them on a narrow, streamlined fuselage. The pilot sat behind and above the gunner, both encased in armor and protected by bulletproof glass. Armament included a turreted 7.62mm minigun or 40mm grenade launcher in the nose, and wing-mounted rocket pods, or Tau anti-tank missiles. The Cobra was fast, reaching speeds over 200 miles per hour. It was agile, capable of diving, banking, and maneuvering in ways that larger helicopters couldn't match. And it was deadly. A Cobra making a gun run would dive from altitude, the minigun firing up to 4,000 rounds per minute, rockets rippling off in pairs, creating a cone of destruction that pulverized targets. Door gunners on transport helicopters would cheer when Cobras arrived overhead, because it meant that enemy fire would be suppressed within seconds. The psychological impact of helicopter warfare extended beyond tactical effects. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces learned to fear the sound of incoming helicopters. The distinctive sound could mean troops were being inserted nearby. It could mean a medical evacuation was happening, which suggested American forces had suffered casualties but were still operational. It could mean reinforcements were arriving, or it could mean gunships were inbound, seconds away from destroying your position. The uncertainty was corrosive to morale. American troops had the opposite reaction. The sound of Hueys meant help was always available. If you were wounded, a medevac helicopter would risk enemy fire to evacuate you. If you were surrounded, reinforcements would be flown in. If you needed ammunition or water or food, helicopters would deliver. The psychological comfort of knowing you weren't abandoned, that the full weight of American military power could be brought to bear within minutes, sustained morale through horrific conditions. The statistics on medical evacuation demonstrated helicopter mobility's life-saving impact. In World War II, the average time from battlefield injury to surgical treatment was measured in days. In Korea, it was measured in hours. In Vietnam, it was measured in minutes. A soldier wounded in combat could be on an operating table within an hour. The speed of evacuation transformed survival rates. Approximately 81% of Americans wounded in Vietnam survived, compared to 74% in World War II and 75% in Korea. Given the intensity of combat and lethality of weapons in Vietnam, this survival rate was extraordinary. Dust-off missions, the radio call sign for medical evacuations, became legendary. Medevac pilots and crew flew unarmed helicopters marked with red crosses, though enemy forces often ignored international law and fired on medical aircraft. The missions were some of the most dangerous in the war. Landing in a hot LZ while wounded soldiers provided covering fire, loading casualties while under fire, taking off through a gauntlet of enemy weapons. Dust-off crews had casualty rates 3 times higher than other helicopter operations. They flew anyway because wounded soldiers needed them. The helicopter also enabled American forces to operate in terrain that would have been impossible for ground forces moving on foot. The Central Highlands featured mountains, jungle-covered ridges, and valleys where movement was measured in meters per hour. Roads were almost non-existent. Supply by ground convoy would have required massive engineering efforts to build roads through hostile territory. Helicopters simply flew over obstacles that would have stopped armies in previous wars. This mobility allowed American strategy to focus on search and destroy operations, rather than holding territory, which would have required enormous numbers of troops to garrison every village and patrol every road. American forces could be concentrated at base camps and then moved by helicopter to wherever enemy forces were detected. Find the enemy, insert forces to engage them, destroy them with superior firepower, then extract and repeat the process elsewhere. The strategy was enabled entirely by helicopter mobility. The enemy adapted as best they could. Anti-aircraft defenses improved. The North Vietnamese deployed thousands of anti-aircraft guns, ranging from 12.7mm machine guns to 37mm and 50mm guns capable of reaching high altitudes. Surface-to-air missiles appeared in North Vietnam and occasionally in Laos, though rarely in South Vietnam, where American air superiority was overwhelming. The trail system through Laos and Cambodia that supplied North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces in the south became heavily defended because disrupting those supply lines was a constant American goal. But adaptation had limits. The fundamental problem facing North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces was that American helicopter mobility allowed the kind of rapid concentration of force that traditional guerrilla tactics couldn't counter. If American intelligence detected enemy forces gathering for an attack, helicopters could insert blocking forces before the attack began. If a small American unit made contact with superior enemy forces, helicopters could bring reinforcements faster than the enemy could exploit their advantage. The traditional guerrilla advantages of choosing when and where to fight were negated by an enemy that could appear anywhere within an hour. The North Vietnamese solution was to avoid the kind of large unit battles that had devastated their forces at Ia Drang. They reverted to guerrilla warfare, ambushes, hit-and-run attacks, and operations designed to inflict casualties while minimizing their own exposure to American firepower. This strategy accepted that they couldn't win decisive battlefield victories. Instead, they aimed to make the war so costly in American lives that political will to continue would collapse. The strategy worked, though it took years and cost hundreds of thousands of North Vietnamese lives. American public support for the war eroded as casualties mounted and victory remained elusive. The helicopter, which had enabled such tactical success, couldn't achieve strategic victory because the enemy refused to fight the kind of war where American advantages were decisive. North Vietnamese forces would retreat into sanctuaries in Cambodia and Laos, where American ground forces weren't allowed to pursue. They would disperse when American forces approached, avoiding combat unless conditions were favorable. They would attack supply lines, fire bases, and isolated outposts rather than engaging in pitched battles. The limitations of airmobile warfare became apparent over time. Helicopters required extensive maintenance and consumed fuel at prodigious rates. A Huey burned 100 gallons per hour in normal operations, more when hauling heavy loads. The logistics of keeping hundreds of helicopters flying required vast supply chains stretching back to the United States. Every helicopter needed spare parts, skilled mechanics, fuel, ammunition, and eventually replacement because the wear and tear of combat operations degraded aircraft faster than peacetime use. Weather could ground helicopters when ground forces couldn't be stopped by weather. Monsoon rains, low clouds, and limited visibility made flying dangerous or impossible. During periods of bad weather, airmobile forces became conventional infantry, losing the mobility advantage that was their primary strength. The enemy learned to time operations during monsoon season when helicopter support would be limited. Terrain also mattered. The jungle canopy in some areas of Vietnam was so dense that helicopters couldn't land, and troops had to be inserted by rope ladder or rappelling slow processes that made units vulnerable during insertion. Mountains created dangerous wind conditions. Rice paddies flooded during monsoon season became obstacles that made ground movement difficult, even after helicopters delivered troops. Despite these limitations, the helicopter fundamentally transformed the character of the Vietnam War. It enabled the kind of rapid reaction force deployment that turned the war into a series of sharp, violent engagements rather than the positional warfare of previous conflicts. It saved thousands of lives through medical evacuation that would have been impossible in earlier wars. It provided fire support and resupply that allowed small American units to operate in remote areas. It gave American commanders a flexibility in deploying forces that the enemy couldn't match. The legacy of Vietnam helicopter operations extended far beyond that conflict. The doctrine developed in Vietnam, the tactics refined through years of combat, the organizational structures that proved effective became the foundation for how modern armies employ helicopters. air assault operations where helicopter-borne infantry seize objectives deep behind enemy lines, became a standard capability for forces around the world. Medical evacuation by helicopter became the standard that every military aspired to provide. Attack helicopters evolved into some of the most lethal weapon systems on modern battlefields. The technology improved dramatically in the decades after Vietnam. Modern helicopters are faster, more powerful, better armed, and more survivable than Vietnam-era aircraft. But the fundamental concepts, the doctrine of how to employ helicopters in combat, was written in the skies above Vietnam by pilots like Bruce Crandall, by soldiers like Hale Moore, by the door gunners and crew chiefs and forward air controllers who made Airmobile operations work. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong who fought against American Airmobile forces remembered the helicopters with a mixture of respect and enduring fear. In post-war accounts, North Vietnamese veterans described the psychological impact of facing an enemy that could appear anywhere, anytime, supported by firepower that seemed limitless. They acknowledged that conventional warfare against American forces was futile, that survival required avoiding the kind of engagements where American advantages were decisive. The helicopter became, in their telling, the symbol of American military power, a technological advantage that changed the nature of the battlefield. For Americans who served in Vietnam, the helicopter meant something different. It meant the difference between life and death for wounded soldiers. It meant reinforcements when positions were being overrun. It meant supplies when units were surrounded. It meant extraction when missions were complete. The helicopter was the physical manifestation of the promise that American soldiers wouldn't be abandoned, that the full weight of American military power would support them. That promise was kept by helicopter crews who flew thousands of missions, who took unimaginable risks, who died by the thousands to support soldiers on the ground. By 1968, at the peak of American involvement in Vietnam, helicopters had become so integral to operations that it was impossible to imagine fighting the war without them. The 1st Cavalry Division alone flew over 400,000 sorties, moved over 800,000 troops, hauled 150,000 tons of cargo, and evacuated over 50,000 casualties. These numbers represented just one division. Army-wide across all of Vietnam, helicopters flew millions of sorties, moved millions of troops, delivered millions of tons of supplies. The scale of operations was unprecedented in military history. The Tet Offensive in early 1968 demonstrated both the power and limitations of American airmobile capabilities. When North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces attacked cities and bases across South Vietnam simultaneously, helicopter mobility allowed American forces to respond rapidly, moving units to threatened areas within hours. The 1st Cavalry Division conducted airmobile operations to relieve besieged bases, insert blocking forces, and pursue withdrawing enemy forces. The operational flexibility enabled by helicopters allowed American forces to defeat the offensive militarily, inflicting catastrophic losses on enemy forces. But Tet also revealed that tactical success didn't translate to strategic victory. Despite heavy losses, the enemy continued fighting. Despite being driven from cities they had temporarily seized, they demonstrated the ability to strike anywhere in South Vietnam. The psychological impact on American public opinion was devastating. Images of fighting in Saigon, of American forces barely holding bases that should have been secure, undermined confidence that the war was being won. Helicopter mobility had enabled American forces to defeat the offensive tactically, but couldn't prevent the strategic defeat in American living rooms. The siege of Khe Sanh in early 1968 showcased helicopter operations under the most difficult conditions imaginable. The Marine Combat Base at Khe Sanh was surrounded by North Vietnamese forces and subjected to months of artillery bombardment. Ground supply was impossible. Everything the Marines needed, ammunition, food, water, medical supplies, had to be flown in by helicopter or cargo aircraft under fire. Helicopters, primarily CH-46 Sea Knights and CH-53 Sea Stallions operated by the Marine Corps, and CH-47 Chinooks operated by the Army, flew into Khe Sanh daily throughout the siege. Many were damaged, some were destroyed, but they kept flying because the Marines at Khe Sanh would have been overrun without resupply. When Operation Pegasus was launched in April 1968 to relieve Khe Sanh, the 1st Cavalry Division conducted the largest airmobile operation of the war to that point. Multiple battalions were airlifted into landing zones around Khe Sanh, establishing positions that threatened North Vietnamese forces from multiple directions. The combination of Marine forces breaking out from Khe Sanh and airmobile forces landing around the perimeter forced the North Vietnamese to withdraw. The siege was broken, not by a ground convoy fighting its way through ambushes, but by helicopter forces that simply flew over North Vietnamese positions and attacked from directions the enemy couldn't defend. As American ground forces began withdrawing from Vietnam, in 1969 and 1970, under Nixon's Vietnamization policy, helicopters became even more critical. Fewer American troops on the ground meant that those remaining needed greater mobility and firepower to maintain effectiveness. Helicopter support allowed smaller American units to cover larger areas, respond to enemy activity rapidly, and provide support to South Vietnamese forces. The air cavalry continued conducting reconnaissance and screening missions, providing early warning of enemy movements and calling in strikes before enemy forces could mass. The incursion into Cambodia in 1970 demonstrated mature airmobile doctrine in action. Helicopter assaults inserted forces deep into Cambodia to attack North Vietnamese sanctuaries and supply caches that had been off-limits. The operations were massive in scale, involving multiple divisions conducting simultaneous air assaults across a front hundreds of kilometers wide. The helicopter mobility allowed American and South Vietnamese forces to penetrate areas that would have required months of ground operations to reach, seize objectives, and withdraw before the enemy could respond effectively. The final major test of helicopter operations came during Operation Lam Son 709 in 1971, the South Vietnamese incursion into Laos. American ground forces were prohibited from entering Laos, but American helicopter support was allowed. South Vietnamese forces were airlifted by American helicopters, supplied by American helicopters, and evacuated by American helicopters when operations went wrong. The operation revealed the limitations of Vietnamization. South Vietnamese forces, despite massive American support, including helicopter mobility, couldn't match the combat effectiveness of the North Vietnamese Army. Helicopter losses during Lam Son 719 were severe, with over 100 destroyed and hundreds more damaged, demonstrating that helicopter operations against a determined enemy with heavy anti-aircraft defenses remained dangerous even after years of experience. By the time the last American ground combat forces withdrew from Vietnam in 1973, the helicopter had become synonymous with the American war effort. Over 12,000 helicopters of all types had served in Vietnam. Approximately 5,000 were destroyed by enemy action or accidents. Over 7,000 survived, many returning to service in other theaters or with other units. The lessons learned from millions of flight hours, thousands of combat missions, and years of constant operations became institutional knowledge that shaped how militaries around the world approached helicopter operations. The men who flew and maintained these helicopters, who door-gunned and crew-chiefed, who loaded wounded and delivered supplies, created a legacy that extended far beyond Vietnam. They demonstrated that helicopters could perform under the most demanding conditions imaginable. They developed tactics that balanced aggression with survival, that achieved mission success while minimizing losses. They proved that helicopter mobility could be decisive in combat, that the theoretical concepts developed at Fort Benning in the early 1960s were valid in the crucible of actual war. For the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong, the helicopter represented everything they hated and feared about American military power. It symbolized technological superiority that no amount of courage or dedication could overcome. It meant that the Americans could appear anywhere, could reinforce faster than North Vietnamese forces, could exploit local advantages, could bring firepower to bear that overwhelmed defensive positions. The distinctive sound of rotor blades became the sound of American power, a reminder that they faced an enemy with resources that seemed limitless. The Viet Cong, who had laughed at early reports of American helicopter operations, who had mocked the idea of flying soldiers into battle like packages, learned through hard experience that underestimating American capabilities was fatal. They learned to fear the sound of Hueys, to recognize the difference between transport helicopters and gunships by sound alone, to know that the rhythmic pounding of rotor blades often meant death was approaching. They learned that engaging American forces when helicopters were overhead was suicidal, that the only advantage they possessed was choosing when to fight. The transformation from object of derision to instrument of tactical dominance took less than a year. From that morning at Landing Zone X-Ray, when Hal Moore's battalion stepped off helicopters into elephant grass, to the massive Airmobile operations of 1966 and beyond, the helicopter proved itself again and again. It didn't win the Vietnam War. Strategic factors, political decisions, and enemy determination meant that no weapon system could achieve victory. But within its tactical realm, the helicopter fundamentally changed how battles were fought, how soldiers were supported, and how modern militaries approached the problem of mobility. The legacy endures in every modern military that employs helicopters in combat. The tactics are refined versions of what was developed in Vietnam. The organizational structures echo the 1st Cavalry Division's pioneering Airmobile organization. The assumption that wounded soldiers will be evacuated rapidly, that forces can be inserted anywhere, that mobility is as important as firepower, all traced directly to lessons written in the skies above Vietnam. They laughed at the helicopters, those Viet Cong commanders who watched the first American Airmobile operations with contempt. They stopped laughing at Landing Zone X-Ray when helicopter after helicopter brought fresh troops, ammunition, and fire support that turned certain defeat into costly victory. They stopped laughing when their casualties mounted, when their forces couldn't maneuver without facing instant response, when the sound of rotor blades meant hiding was the only option. The age of airmobile warfare had arrived, announced by the whomp, whomp, whomp of Huey rotor blades cutting through Vietnamese skies, written in the courage of pilots and crew who flew into hell because soldiers on the ground needed them. The revolution in warfare that theorists had imagined became reality in the central highlands of Vietnam, where helicopter operations transformed military doctrine and saved thousands of American lives. The laughter died in the jungle. the sound of rotor blades echoed across battlefields for years, and warfare was never the same.